Turkey is grateful for U.S. support, for the support that you and I gave, decisive support, for its campaign of murderous state terror, as incidentally it was called accurately by Turkey's Minister of Human Rights and by very courageous Turkish intellectuals, among them a prominent sociologist who spent much of his life in prison for recording the facts. He actually rejected an award from the Fund for Free Expression here because of U.S. support for Turkey's murderous state terror. In gratitude for Clinton's enormous contributions to massive international terrorism, Prime Minister Ecevit was the first to offer troops to fight the war on terror in Afghanistan. And now Turkey has just been selected to serve as the force to protect Kabul from terrorism funded by Washington. There are others, too, who happily enlist on the war on terror. So no one's more enthusiastic than the Russians, who are eager to have U.S. support for their own monstrous crimes in Chechnya, or the brutal dictator of Uzbekistan, who's also our kind of guy right now. Well, again, Orwell would have been open-mouthed in astonishment as all of this proceeds, evoking little comment. But if we want to break convention and have a look at what we're doing, we can learn a lot about the war on terror and more generally about the effects of September 11th on policy. Well, let's move to today's headlines right now. So take Israel. Sharon is a man of peace, as the president just described him, despite an impressive record of terrorist atrocities, includes large-scale massacres of defenseless civilians back in the early 1950s, brutal expulsion of thousands of Bedouins 20 years later under the Labor government, destroying their lands, mosques, cemeteries, driving them into the desert, to clear northeast Sinai for Jewish settlement, the background for the 1973 war, and including, of course, the 1982 war fought in Lebanon, killing 20,000 people, in order to secure Israeli control over the occupied territories, and other atrocities, all of them international terrorism, because they rely crucially on U.S. support since the 1970s. And the last few weeks, horrible as they are nothing all that new. I personally saw similar things firsthand in the West Bank during the first Intifada, 1988. In this attack, the most ferocious and destructive weapons that destroyed the Jenin refugee camp and the ancient Kasbah, the old city in Nablus, in ways reminiscent of the Taliban if you look closely, the most ferocious weapons were U.S. helicopters, supplied in the full knowledge that they're going to be used for those purposes. There's no doubt about it. It's a pretty ugly story. It bears retelling. It involves Clinton and the U.S. media, including ours right here. I'll come back to it if you like. Furthermore, the U.S. government remains active right now in enhancing terror there, on borrowing the president's words. So in last December, the Security Council debated a resolution calling for the implementation of the Mitchell Plan and the dispatch of international monitors to oversee the reduction of violence. That's the most effective means, as is generally recognized. Such efforts are routinely blocked by Washington. Again, this was vetoed on December 14th. That particular veto happened to be taking place during a 21-day period of calm. That means that only one Israeli soldier was killed, along with 21 Palestinians, including 11 children, and 16 incursions into areas under Palestinian control. 10 days before the U.S. veto, there was a conference in Geneva, important conference, which the U.S. boycotted and therefore undermined, a conference that once again concluded that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to the occupied territories. That entails that virtually everything that the United States and Israel do there is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions, meaning a war crime of unusual severity, grave breach under U.S. law. The conference, which included the European Union, even Britain went along, specifically declared that the U.S.-funded Israeli settlements are illegal, and it condemned, I'm quoting it now, it condemned the practice of willful killing, torture, unlawful deportation, willful depriving of the rights of fair and regular trial, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, carried out unlawfully and wantonly. They're not talking about the last couple of weeks. This is December 5th. The United States is a high contracting party of the Geneva Conventions, and therefore it is obligated by solemn treaty to prosecute those who are responsible for such crimes, including the U.S. leadership, going back 30 years. The United States has not officially withdrawn its recognition of the applicability of the Geneva Conventions to the occupied territories, nor has it withdrawn its official censure of Israeli violations as the occupying power. I'm quoting George Bush the first when he was UN ambassador. In October, and that remains official policy. In October 2000, the Security Council reaffirmed the consensus on this matter. It called on Israel, I'm quoting, called on Israel, the occupying power, to abide scrupulously by its legal obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Remember, that excludes just about everything that's happening there as a war crime. The vote was 14-0. It means it becomes international law. The 0 is because of one abstention. Clinton abstained, presumably not wanting to veto one of the core principles of international humanitarian law, particularly in the light of the circumstances in which it was enacted in 1949 in order to criminalize formally the atrocities of the Nazis in occupied territories. Well, all of this is another significant contribution to enhancing terror, all the more so because it's scarcely reported. The Geneva Conference, in fact, wasn't reported, and very quickly consigned to the memory hole, which is already amply furnished with our own quickly forgotten crimes. None of this, however, is forgotten by the victims. Yes, September 11th was a horrifying atrocity. Unfortunately, it's not new. What's new is the direction in which the guns are pointing. For the first time in the history of Europe and its offshoots, that is us, they were the victims, not the perpetrators of horrifying crimes of this nature. And that's a historic event. Why was it carried out? Second question. Well, here we have to make a distinction between two groups. One is the actual perpetrators. I assume, as everyone else does, that it's either Al-Qaeda or something very like them. And why they did it is there's no one who knows that, the answer to that any better than the CIA, which recruited them, armed them, trained them, directed them to cause maximal harm to the Russians, and not to help the Afghans, which would have been a legitimate objective. The same special forces that are chasing them around in Tora Bora a few years earlier were training them to carry out terrorist atrocities. And they did. They carried out, during the 80s, they carried out terrorist acts within Russia, which were pretty serious, almost led to a Russia-Pakistan war at one point. That all ended in 1989 when the Russians withdrew. They didn't stop their terrorism against the Russians because they love Russians, they hate them, but rather because they had achieved their objective, which was clear and explicit. The objective was to drive the infidels out of the Muslim lands so that they could initiate their own reign of terror, as they immediately did. In 1990, they turned against the United States for essentially the same reasons. From their point of view, the United States is occupying Saudi Arabia, even much more significant than occupying Afghanistan for them. Their own terrorist record goes back 20 years to the time when the CIA and British intelligence and its allies organized and trained them. In 1993, they made their first attempt to blow up the World Trade Center. Actually, they had much more ambitious plans. I'm sure you know there was a Dutch government inquiry into the Srebrenica atrocities. It was just released last week. From it, we learned that at the same time that they were trying to blow up the World Trade Center, U.S. C-130s were flying radical Islamist mujahideen from Afghanistan to the Balkans, also Iranian-backed Hezbollah fighters, and also a huge flow of arms going through Croatia, which took a substantial cut. They were there to support the U.S. side in the Balkan wars, while Israel, Ukraine, and Greece were arming the other side, which explains why unexploded mortar bombs landing in Sarajevo sometimes had Hebrew markings, quoting a British political scientist reviewing the report that was published last week by the Dutch government.